You are listening to Pan-Africanism as World History on Mr. Little's History Bites. In 1963, in the newly independent nation of Ghana in West Africa, a man named Wilkin Edward Burghardt Du Bois, more commonly known as W.E.B. Du Bois, passed away in his home at the age of 95. Du Bois had been a giant in the American civil rights movement, yet his passing garnered hardly any attention in the American press. Through his lifetime, Du Bois had organized the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, published pioneering works in sociology, but it was his unique work with a group called Pan-Africanists that I'd like to discuss today. Du Bois himself organized and attended 5 Pan-African Congresses over the course of his life, and was once quoted as saying, "The question of the 20th century is the color line." But he wasn't referring to the American South or even the United States as a whole, no. He was referring to the line between, quote, the darker races and the lighter races in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the islands of the sea. Du Bois had moved to Ghana near the end of his life at the invitation of Ghana's first independent leader, Kwame Nkrumah, where he spent his last years publishing books on African history, while his wife, Shirley Du Bois, helped put together Ghana's first TV station. Born in 1868, a mere 3 years after the end of slavery in the United States, Du Bois lived quite the life. He grew up and fought for civil rights in his own United States, but he did live long enough to see the decolonization of Africa. His political affiliation with socialist and communist parties led to a falling out between him and mainstream civil rights leaders, as well as the government of the United States. Du Bois's journey is indicative of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is usually simply a key term in an American history textbook. Pan-Africanism, although it has many definitions, in general, is the concept of either cultural or political unity within Africa, or possibly both, and sometimes Africa as well as the African Diaspora. Now, Pan-Africanism's definition has fluctuated and changed throughout the course of history, but in that fluctuation and in that change is the reason why Pan-Africanism has played such a large role in the history of the 19th and the 20th century. Pan-Africanism has served as a tool of resistance, Pan-Africanism has served as a social movement, and Pan-Africanism is world history. So what are the origins of the idea of Pan-Africanism? Where does this thought come from that all of Africa ought to be united, either culturally or politically? Well, it begins with the African Diaspora. The first Pan-Africanists were actually from outside of Africa. And we should talk a little bit about the diaspora itself. Now, when you discuss the African Diaspora, that is the Africans living outside of Africa, or people of African descent living outside of Africa, almost immediately our minds jump to slavery, and with good reason. By far, perhaps the largest number of people moved out of Africa were the result of slaving institutions and the slave trade. But I don't want to start with the slave trade. And I want to emphasize that the African Diaspora does not begin with slavery. And if you start your discussion with a lack of agency on the part of the diaspora, that probably is where your discussion might end. So I'd like to point out that the African Diaspora has existed long before any slaving institution in the Atlantic, and long before the Islamic slave trade. There is well-documented evidence of African mercenaries serving with the Roman military. In the Christian Bible, there is reference to Ethiopian political officials paying visits to the Roman Empire in the Christian New Testament. In South and Southeast Asia, there were terms for those merchants who came to do business from Africa. Habshish for those in West Africa, and Sidis, those from East Africa. In South Asia, the government of the Delhi Sultanate was at one point headed for several generations by those descended from African mercenaries. In particular, in the 15th century, Urbak Shah of the Delhi Sultan was descended from mercenaries from East Africa. The conquest of the Americas, specifically the Aztec Empire, included one free African mercenary who willingly signed up with the Spanish, named Juan Garrido from the Central African Kingdom of Congo. He participated in the initial battles and in the final siege of Tenochtitlan, alongside Cortés. In the Islamic world, one of the very first Muslims and one of the first muhaddin, or those who do the call to prayer, was a former black slave named Bilal ibn Rabah. Now, of course, these examples do not demonstrate that numerically, willing and free migration out of Africa made up the majority of those outside of Africa. The two slave trades combined over the course of 1,000 years perhaps moved 24 million individuals out of Africa into other parts of the world. Prior to the late 1800s, although there were many discussions and a few minor attempts for people to form African communities back in Africa from, say, freed slaves in the Americas, such as the Colonization Society in the pre-Civil War United States, Pan-Africanism really takes off in the late 1800s, and there's some questions about why this is. Well, first of all, it is probably, at least in part, because slavery at least officially ended in most Western countries around the late 1800s. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888, which, while it did not give full and equal equality anywhere to those of African descent, did create some room to imagine and did create some mobility, and resulted in the rise of an intellectual class in the United States and other countries in the Americas. We can also credit the idea of nationalism, which was sweeping the globe at this time, the idea that every group or community or race should have its own state. It's not surprising that many intellectuals took this idea and applied it to those of African descent. We must also credit imperialism, but not necessarily the act of imperialism itself, but rather the act of resisting imperialism, and I'm referring specifically to the Battle of Adwa, in which the Ethiopians defeated an invading army of Italians. Adwa is one of many resistance stories, but it has a powerful grip on the imagination because it is a militarily successful resistance story. This happened in the 1890s, and no doubt contributed to the notion of a free Africa, or a united Africa. Scholars have pointed out that the opening chapters of the Pan-Africanism story begin with intellectuals of the diaspora, such as W.E.B. Dubois, whom I mentioned earlier. That Dubois had organized a number of Pan-African conferences over the course of his life. These conferences, held variously between the early 1900s and the 1940s, before the independence of the first African states, reaffirmed the rights of African states to independence and the rights of all African peoples inside and outside of Africa to dignity and respect. In particular, while not specifically Pan-African, the Universal Race Conference held in London in 1911 was decisive because it definitively attempted to state that there was no scientific basis for arguing that one race was superior to the other. Now, this was important because you have to remember that at the time, one of the grand justifications for European imperialism had been a pseudo-science that somehow those of African descent were less intelligent than those of European descent, and those of Asian descent were less intelligent than those of European descent, etc., etc. W.E.B. Du Bois, as a scholar and a sociologist, definitively said that this was not the case. And while W.E.B. Du Bois is famous for his work in the United States, as well as being an early Pan-Africanist, he is not the most famous or the most well-known. Perhaps the most well-known or most famous Pan-African activist in the early 1900s was a man named Marcus Garvey, or as he liked to call himself, the Honorable Marcus Garvey. The Jamaican-born writer and intellectual who, as a young boy, noticed the disparity in the treatment between himself and his white peers, even in post-slavery Jamaica. Marcus Garvey spent his youth as a printer's apprentice, and when he was 23, he traveled to Central America, where he saw black laborers working in the fields. To him, this didn't seem much different from slavery, and it got him thinking. After his trip to Central America, he said, and I quote, "I was determined that the black man would not be kicked about, as I had seen him in Central America. I asked myself, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president and his men of big affairs? I looked about, and I could not find them." And so Marcus Garvey set to work. One of his first acts of ideological resistance was to found the Universal Negro Improvement Association, commonly known as UNIA. Now, this organization centered around educating and informing those of African descent of their history and their culture. Some people have described UNIA meetings as part church, part history lecture. The UNIA also offered job training and was a sort of social safety net. When he was in his early 30s, Marcus Garvey brought the UNIA to the United States after fleeing some trouble in Jamaica, where it became a massive movement of millions of people. It had a flag which has since been adopted by many African nationalist groups. The red, black, and green. The red for the blood of the martyrs, the black for the skin of Africans and the green for the vegetation and the wealth of Africa. Marcus Garvey's organization in the United States played a pivotal role in the 1920s of organizing and bringing together African Americans from across the nation. And although he feuded with W.E.B. Dubois, who didn't like the militant stance of Marcus Garvey, he nonetheless held the attention of many African Americans. In particular, Marcus Garvey spoke of, quote, going back to Africa. Now, what exactly he meant by that has always been up for some dispute. But a lot of scholars agree that Marcus Garvey didn't literally mean everybody in America would go back to Africa. All the African Americans in America would go back to Africa. Rather, he meant that they should conceptualize it as an idea, back to Africa in their minds. They should look at themselves not as Americans, but as the descendants of Africans. Marcus Garvey himself famously told people time and again, your history does not begin with slavery. But Marcus Garvey also attempted to organize a sort of back to Africa movement in a literal sense as well. He founded a shipping company called the Black Star Line. And the idea was that the Black Star Line would serve black businesses in the Americas and perhaps someday take people back to Africa. Unfortunately, while Marcus Garvey was an excellent organizer and a compelling speaker, he was not a terribly good money manager, and the Black Star Line very quickly went bankrupt, and the mismanagement of the Black Star Line would be one of the pretexts by which the United States government deported Garvey back to Jamaica at the end of the 1920s. During the course of his organization, UNIA published the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro People of the World, which, much like Du Bois's Pan-African conferences, reaffirmed the dignity and respect of those of African descent no matter where they may be living. The UNIA's anthem stated definitively, Africa for Africans, which may sound a little extreme today, but you have to remember this is coming off of a century of scientific racism, cultural oppression, and the idea that Africa didn't even have a history. Marcus Garvey, although he deported from the United States and died in London in 1940, nonetheless left a very strong legacy in the idea of Pan-Africanists. Malcolm X, the 1960s civil rights leader and black nationalist, was directly inspired by Marcus Garvey. Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, was a member of UNIA, and is perhaps one of the reasons that he was killed, although officially his death was a suicide. Malcolm suspected that his father may have been killed for his activities. Malcolm did not believe in integration, like Martin Luther King did. Much in the same way Garvey had, Malcolm believed that black people needed to make their own state. Now, Malcolm X was a Muslim and a member of the Nation of Islam, and near the end of his life he undertook his Hajj, which is a requirement of all Muslims. And while he was there, he visited a number of newly independent states in Africa, where he, in fact, asked for support from these African states to assist African Americans in the United States. How practical this might have been is somewhat of an open question, but nonetheless, the very act of going to Africa to ask for help for those of African descent in the United States is perhaps the epitome of Pan-Africanism. While Marcus Garvey's movement may have petered out in the late 1930s and 40s, it nonetheless had a ripple effect. In Marcus Garvey's native Jamaica, a movement arose known today around the world as the Rastafarian movement. And in many ways, the Rastafarian movement is one of Garvey's legacies. Now, Rastafarianism is a religious movement that has its roots in Jamaica. It is a monotheistic religion that has a lot of similarities to Christianity, with a few notable differences being that the Messiah, instead of being Jesus Christ, or perhaps in addition to Jesus Christ, was Haile Selassie, who was the Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974. In fact, the word Rastafarianism comes from the Ethiopian word Ras Tafari. Haile Selassie was the prince. He was known as the Ras, and his name had actually been Tafari. In 1930, when Haile Selassie was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, a number of religious preachers in Jamaica claimed that this was the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy of the Messiah, as prophesied in the Old Testament. Now, there are a number of other smaller differences from mainstream Christianity. For example, something called the grounding ceremony, which involves discussions and lively music, in addition to the religiously sanctioned use of cannabis, which was in fact brought to Jamaica by slaves. There's a great level of syncretism between African traditions and Christianity in Rastafarianism. But to understand why Rastafarianism is a Pan-African movement, you have to understand the role that Ethiopia plays and the incredible grip on the imagination that Ethiopia has. Remember that Ethiopia not only was the only state in Africa that preserved its independence via military victory, but Ethiopia for centuries has had a grip on the mind of the world. In much of the Middle Ages, Ethiopia was a synonym for Africa. One of the reasons for Columbus's voyages and Prince Henry the Navigator's voyages were to go out and to find the legendary king of Ethiopia, Prester John. Even in the Islamic world, Ethiopia holds a special place as being one of the sanctuaries where the followers of Muhammad fled to. So Ethiopia has long held a very strong grip on the imagination of people outside of Africa when thinking of Africa. When considering how Rastafarianism is connected to the Pan-African movement, one need only think of Bob Marley's famous song, Africa Unite. Another one of Marcus Garvey's echoes was the West African Student Union, founded in London in 1925 by 21 law students from West Africa. It was supported by Amy Ashwood, who was Marcus Garvey's wife. And while it eventually established 20 branches across London, it was led by individuals who would later go on to be leaders in their post-independence countries of Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Ghana. Its objective was ostensibly to educate college students from Africa about their history. They established hostels and reading rooms. But the West African Student Union did more than simply talk about reclaiming African history and African dignity. They actively did it as well. In 1937, the West African Students' Union sent financial support to cocoa farmers in British-ruled West Africa who were on strike against the Cadbury Company. Cadbury, you know, that company that makes the famous eggs? The farmers were on strike demanding better prices for their cocoa, which eventually did negotiate for better terms. All of these organizations, although they predate the independence movement, demonstrate that Pan-Africanism has its roots outside of Africa, but nonetheless sought to actively assist in what these individuals saw as the restoration of Africa. In this early stage, Pan-Africanism usually took on a sort of dreamy intellectual form, if you will, a poetic resistance, but nonetheless one that is important because it allowed individuals to challenge the reigning norms of African inferiority. And although there was a lot of talk of uniting Africa during the independence struggles, and there was some small-scale political unification. For example, Mali and Guinea were unified for a short time upon independence from France. The independence struggle focused on making sure every European designated colony was able to get its independence. And then the idea seemed to be there would be some sort of post-independence unit. But it's important to understand that independence for these states of Africa did not come all at once. It came very slowly. It came in pieces. Sometimes it came peacefully. Sometimes it came incredibly violently. Sometimes it came relatively quickly, in a year or two, like for Ghana, and sometimes it took over a decade, as in the case of Angola and Mozambique. And so throughout this time, Pan-Africanists' objective was to rid the continent of European rule. And then, once the European powers had all been driven out of Africa, it was to end apartheid rule, or minority rule, in South Africa and Rhodesia. Pan-Africanism continued to guide the thinking of many post-independence leaders as well as thinkers. Kwame Nkrumah, who I mentioned earlier, was the first leader of an independent nation, specifically Ghana. He had attended several of W.E.B. Dubois's Pan-African conferences and invited W.E.B. Du Bois to live in Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah once said in a speech to other African leaders, quote, "Our salvation and strength, and the only way out of the ravages afflicting Africa, lies in political unity." And he attempted to further this goal. He helped found the Organization of African Unity, which would later become the African Union, which seeks to push for closer ties between African states. He supported the end of apartheid and sent financial assistance to new nations. Kwame Nkrumah also sponsored advisors from countries around the world to assist not only his own nation of Ghana, but to assist other nations throughout Africa as well. Kwame Nkrumah looked favorably upon what he called the, quote, East. He took a great deal of inspiration from China, the Soviet Union, as well as the newly independent states of Southeast Asia. This could be in part because he was rejecting the ideological and political framework of Western Europe and the United States, who he viewed as those who had enslaved Africa. But regardless of which sort of ideological framework he supported, he nonetheless attempted to elicit aid from those countries to assist the new nations of Africa in rebuilding. Pan-Africanism during this time also reflects the wider ideological breach in the Cold War. Two famous Pan-African intellectuals during this time, Walter Rodney from Guyana in South America, as well as Amir Césaire from French Martinique, which is off the coast of Madagascar. Both of these men represented different branches of thinking within Pan-Africanism. Both men initially had very strong socialist communist leanings. However, Émile Césaire became disillusioned with the Communist Party and most famously wrote a letter to the head of the French Communist Party stating that he was unequivocally leaving the party. He justified his exiting of the Communist Party, stating that, quote, "Black people need their own institutions. Black people need their own organizations, made by them, adopted for them, and created for ends which they themselves can determine." Émile Césaire did not necessarily disagree with many of the ideas of communism, but he felt that international communism was being led and dominated by the political North, and would not make room for Africa. His discourses on colonialism. Émile Césaire harshly rebukes European powers who colonized Africa, stating that any power that would go out and conquer another nation, colonize another nation, is already a sick nation. Perhaps one of Émile Césaire's lasting influences the Négritude movement, but it was the Martinique-born writer and activist Paulette Nadal which actually placed one of the very important cornerstones of the Négritude movement. While she was studying writing in France, she brought together a number of African intellectuals in the years before World War II. In what has been called the Clermont Salon, a regular meeting of Pan-Africanist intellectuals in Paris, this included a number of future leaders, such as Émile Césaire himself. Among Paulette Nadal's most well-known works is La Revue du Monde Noir, or French for The Review of the Black World. This series of articles explored the particular role of women in the Pan-African movement and the wider world. Paulette Nadal would later move back to her native Martinique after World War II, and she would shift her focus to women's issues globally, founding several organizations. But perhaps the most fascinating and important work that Paulette Nadal did while she was to translate some of the works of the Harlem Renaissance from English into French. The Harlem Renaissance, as students of American history might know, was a cultural and literary movement in Harlem, which was part of New York City in the United States during the 1920s. This included authors who explored the roles of African Americans in U.S. society, resisting the entrenched racism of this society, as well as examining the values of their own communities. Such authors included literary heavyweights such as Langston Hughes and Herbert Harrison. And while Négritude has many examples and definitions, in general, what Négritude was an effort to popularize and appreciate African art, from the written word to the spoken word to physical artistic works. And it sought to question the preconceived and pre-assumed dominance of European cultural forms. The efforts of Paulette Nadal to translate these works and make sure they could get to the French-speaking Pan-African communities demonstrates the transatlantic nature of this movement, connecting a local cultural American movement in the U.S. in the 1920s to a literary art movement that begins in the 1960s. Walter Rodney is well known for his intellectual feats, and probably most famously rebuked the concept of the white man's burden and the civilizing mission of Europeans in Africa by claiming that in 600 years of their civilizing mission, the Portuguese had failed to train a single African doctor. But for Walter Rodney, Pan-Africanism was not something that he necessarily looked to right away. For Walter Rodney, it was the class character of the African petite bourgeoisie that imposed the concrete limits on Pan-Africanism. Petite bourgeoisie is a socialist term that refers to those who may not be of the ownership class, but have a vested interest in preserving or maintaining the ownership class. For Walter Rodney, these were lawyers and place seekers who took control of the newly independent states. If Pan-Africanism, according to Walter Rodney, was to play a role in society, then the masses had to retake the leadership of the movement from the petite bourgeoisie. A good example of how Walter Rodney felt about Pan-Africanism is exemplified by his description of the Organization of African Unity. According to Walter Rodney, quote, "The OAU does far more to frustrate than realize the concept of African unity. At best, the OAU regulates a few internal conflicts between the petite bourgeoisie from different parts of the continent. Beyond that, it is committed to maintain the separation of African people implicit in the present territorial boundaries." It is interesting to note that Walter Rodney, Émile Césaire, and Paulette Nadal, all of whom contributed so much to the ideas and interpretations of Pan-Africanism, all came from outside of mainland Africa. One more piece of evidence reflecting the international nature of the Pan-African movement. Since the 1990s, arguably many of the goals of Pan-Africanists have been achieved. Africa is no longer under European domination, and white minority rule has ended in both Zimbabwe, and South Africa. But nonetheless, Pan-Africanism continues on the minds of Africans today. Again, Bob Marley's song Africa Unite was played at the integration of black majority rule in Zimbabwe in 1980. On a political level, some of the goals of Pan-Africanists may be coming closer to reality than initially believed. Almost all of Africa is connected by various trade agreements, free trade blocs, customs unions, and other special economic zones that make it easier to do business within Africa. One note in particular is the East African Community, which is an organization of 6 countries in the African Great Lakes region of East Africa, specifically Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. While initially founded as an intergovernmental common market, that is a place where all the states share one common market, much like the European Union, the East African Community is planning to form into the East African Federation at some point in the near future. Of course, creating future states can always be fraught with uncertainty and pitfalls, but nonetheless, in 2018, a committee has been formed to draft up the necessary legal documents and guidelines. The idea is that all 6 of the members of the East African Community will come together and form the East African Federation, a single sovereign entity. The East African Federation would represent the completion of a number of Pan-Africanist goals. But perhaps the future of Pan-Africanism is no longer in the realm of politics. Perhaps the future of Pan-Africanism is going to go back to its roots of being the realm of ideas and inspiration. The Ghanaian-born stock trader, the first African to trade on the London Stock Exchange, Tutu Agyare, described in a 2010 speech that Pan-Africanism is about reclaiming African traditions and history, but for the problems of Africa today. For him, the problems of Africa today are no longer political independence, but the long-term challenges facing Africa, including demographic growth, 50% of the world's youth will be in Africa, fundamental challenges of maintaining a standard of living and balancing out the ecological impact of humans, as well as developing common economic bonds across African nations. As Agyare pointed out in his speech, it costs almost 4 times as much to ship a ton of fertilizer across Africa as it does to ship a ton of fertilizer all the way from the United States to Africa itself. In conclusion, the ever-changing definition of Pan-Africanism is a testament to its international nature. Pan-Africanism was born from the experiences of the African Diaspora, largely created from the economic integration of the Atlantic world in the 1400s. Pan-Africanism grew out of both a sense of resisting Western imperialism in Africa and envisioning a new concept of political society, reflecting the political changes taking place in the world, such as the abolition of slavery, the Enlightenment, the rise of nationalism, and resistance to imperialism. Pan-Africanists reflected the changes of the 20th century. They were active in intellectual movements in the interwar years, the decolonization movements after World War II, both peaceful and violent. And a number of Pan-Africanists took inspiration from the ideas of communism, while others sought to promote a more cultural Pan-Africanist movement. Rastafarianism and Négritude both are international movements which have adherents worldwide, and their roots lie in those who believed in and espoused Pan-Africanism. In short, Pan-Africanism is world history, almost as a parallel to the established world history since the 19th century. It is a testament to those members of the African diaspora who challenged the status quo on many fronts: racism, colonization, cultural oppression, and economic imperialism. And this movement and its many ideas will continue in the future. I want to thank you for joining me on this bite of history. I hope you've learned something, but I also hope you walk away with a few questions. This is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.